Hello, and welcome to the Source of Life podcast, a podcast on water history in the ancient and medieval Middle East. In this podcast, our main focus is on pre-modern Middle Eastern cities and the way that water was brought to them and used within them. But cities are difficult to study. Their systems are complex, and if they are still in use today, then their archaeology is rarely accessible for study. So today, we're going to look at the more complete evidence of a smaller settlement, a building complex which has been in use for 16 centuries, the famous White Monastery of the Coptic Saint Shenouda, located in Upper Egypt. To do this, I'll be talking to Louise Blanke, Senior Lecturer in Late Antique Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me in this podcast.
So, just to start with, what first made you interested in researching water? I guess a lot of archaeologists come across watery infrastructure in their work and document it, but maybe less people decide to actually put the pieces of the puzzle together and think in a more connected way about water. So, what spiked your interest?
It really started with two main things. I've always been very interested in how settlements work, in trying to understand settlements from a bottom up approach. So I've been frustrated with how archaeology is done, not just in monastic archaeology, but in cities as well, especially in past archaeological explorations. In that, there's been a real focus on the monumental architecture. So, for monasteries, people were interested in churches; cities, people were interested also in churches and temples and so on. All these great big monuments that do look very impressive when you visit a site, but they don't tell us very much about how a site functioned. And I really wanted to sort of start at the lowest level and try to understand what's daily life like for people who live there. And really central aspect of that is understanding water supply systems. It tells us a lot about the everything from the life quality of the people who were living at the site, but also, and perhaps most relevant for my work, it can actually tell us a lot about the organization of a site. It can tell us how the site was managed, how it was run, but also how different parts of the sites were used. Location of pipes, for example, can help us understand certain areas. Um, and that was really what sparked my curiosity. And then I thought it was fascinating that you could actually trace how the planning and sort of the architectural planning of water supply systems in that there has been a very very careful thought out process in laying out how water was brought to the site and how it was distributed and how it was used.
So you've worked on various sites, but you've spent quite a bit of time looking on this site called the White Monastery, which is in Egypt. So could you just tell us a little bit of basic information to get us started? Where is the White Monastery? What kind of environment is it based in?
The White Monastery is located in Egypt. It's in the part of Egypt called Upper Egypt, and it's roughly about 600 kilometers south of Cairo. The White Monastery is set not quite in the desert, not quite in the Nile Valley. It's just on the edge of the Nile Valley, on the western side of the Nile.
And what kind of environment is that? What does it look like? What would it be like to live there?
So it's this very interesting contrast between the White Monastery being perceived as being a desert monastery, but it is actually just on the edge of the cultivation. So if you visit the site today, what you will see is that you're in an area that is obviously very sandy. It's got the lower desert. That's where the White Monastery is located. And then if you look towards the desert, if you look towards the west, and you can see the mountains of the lower plateau of what's basically the start of the Sahara is rising up. So that's Egypt's western desert. However, if you turn around, if you look the other way, then you look at the cultivated Nile Valley. And the extent of the Nile Valley, the width of the Nile Valley would have been approximately the same today as it was in late antiquity. So it's really important to keep in mind that yes, the White Monastery was located in the desert, but it was also just at the edge of the cultivation, and that's the two type of environments that the inhabitants would have been interacting with.
And could you just tell us a little more about the sort of function of the site? Maybe a quick history of the White Monastery. So, um, your title is Lecturer of Late Antique Archaeology, but this is also a site that went into the Islamic period, as I understand. What's the sort of brief history and importance of the site?
So the White Monastery was founded in the 4th century. It was really made famous by its third abbot, Shenute. And Shenute was a very prolific writer of Coptic, and also he was a zealous anti-pagan. He has left numerous letters and sermons, and probably, as far as I understand, is by far the largest corpus of late antique Coptic texts, and therefore a really important source to understanding Christianity, monasticism, but also just life in late antiquity. Um, we see the sort of heyday of the White Monasteries is from the time of Shenute's rule, where the monastery is transformed to quite a monumental site, a very large site, and it doesn't just consist of the White Monastery itself. It was probably part of what we can call a federation of three different monasteries, at least three monasteries. The two other monasteries was another male monastery, the Red Monastery, located just north of the White Monastery, and also a site, a monastic site in the village of Thribe, which is just south of the White Monastery, which was home to female monastics. Um, we can also see at this time that at some point around the 5th century, the White Monastery grew to a size, the intramural size grew to a size of around 75,000 square meters, which makes it one of the largest monasteries in Egypt. And this is very, very large indeed for a monastic site. Um, and it looks like it maintains a site size into probably about the 8th century, and perhaps even into the 9th century. And then we see a gradual shrinkage in the monastery. So areas that were used for production in the past, they are now used for rubbish disposals. Other areas that were also part of the built environment are used for burial. And we see this gradual contraction towards the main monastic church. This 5th century church was built under the rule of Sinuta, which still stands today. So when we get to the point of the 14th century, we got textual sources that are describing the White Monastery as being in ruins. But at the same time, you can see there's still activity at the site. We got manuscripts with colophons that were produced in the 16th century. We've got traveling accounts that are talking about communities living inside the church itself. So basically, what we see at some point of starting gradually in the 8th, 9th century, but then over the coming centuries with this gradual contraction until the point where the entire community, perhaps not necessarily a monastic community, but just a Christian community, is living inside the church. And that seems to have carried on all the way up until today, until, or at least until the 90s. In the late 90s, the White Monastery was reinstated as a monastery, and that was when the modern monastery was formed. And today is home to, as far as I'm aware, some 20 odd monks and around 50 novices or so, and it's continuously expanding. So we're looking at a site that has approximately 1600 years of continuous usage.
And so 75,000 square meters, you say, at its height. That really is does sound like quite a considerable area. How many people are we talking about? Is it possible to estimate how many monks and non-monks might have been living? And when you say that, are you talking about the other two monasteries of the Federation, or you're just talking about the White Monastery site itself?
When I'm talking about 75,000 square meters, that's just the White Monastery. Um, when we're looking at the number of people, we do have some textual sources, and this is quite an interesting point in that we've got textual sources. One text in particular, the Arabic life of Shenute, which is this hagiographical text reporting on the miracles performed by Shenute. And this text does talk about how many monastics lived in the three different monasteries, and it's a very very much an inflated number. I try to do some calculations based on the space that we have available. to estimate how many people would actually live in the monastery. And looking at the rules of Shinute, so the monastic rules that were written by Shinute, or at least collected at the time of Shinute, one of the rules states that all monastics should be able to eat together once a day in the refectory. So we have a building that we have interpreted as being a refectory, and then what I tried to do was to calculate how many people could actually fit into the space by comparing to especially the monastic side in Athriba, the female monastery, where we do actually have seating remains. So looking at that space in Athriba, then sort of transporting the figures to the White Monastery gives us an estimate of a maximum of 500 people who could have actually eaten that refectory at the same time. And that's probably quite sort of a generous number. So somewhere below 500 monastics at the White Monastery, I would say. Now, how many lay people were at the monastery is a completely different question and one that I cannot answer. We have sources from other monasteries that refer to lay people, servants, and so on. But it would be a complete guess whether they were actually present at any point in time in the White Monastery and how many there were.
Right, but we're not talking about a small pocket of hermits living in a cave. We're talking about something that's a significant, bustling settlement with probably quite a significant economic footprint.
Yes, we should probably think about the White Monastery as being the size of a large village. And if you're looking at the built environment, then you can see it is very well organized indeed. We got structures that are clearly designed for a specific type of production. There seems to have been a fairly substantial level of oil production. We also got other areas designed for food production, and they all very, very neatly lined out. We can see how carefully these areas were planned. To give you an example, if we're looking at the monastic kitchen area, we got 7 bread ovens that are lined up right next to each other. So it's very clear that there's a lot of planning that's got into this monastic community. It's not a matter of having a settlement that's just sort of gradually grown up. There's actually been someone who's been sitting down, drawing a plan of which buildings should be where, and then they've been built.
So, is there anything else we need to know about the site, the archaeological site, and then what can we see of the water supply? Maybe starting off with the sources, like where did the water come from that people were drinking or using in this production?
I think one thing that's really important to state about the monastic site is that I mentioned that it's approximately 75,000 square meters. About 25% of that has been excavated. For any listeners who are archaeologists, they would know that that's a very high percentage. That means we have a fairly good idea of its layout. It's mainly the central part of the monastery that's been excavated, but that gives us a good, clear, a good opportunity to study the water supply system. Um, so talking about the sources for the water, we have 2 wells, and one well is located about 100 meters northwest of the monastic church, and the other well is located inside the church. Now, I think when people are thinking about wells, commonly they think about this sweet little structure with a bucket. That's not what we're looking at here. This is monumental architecture, and it's has required very skilled labor, very careful planning, and also someone with very detailed know-how of how to actually construct wells. So the main well, for example, if you're looking at the top, it's rectangular in shape. It's about 6 by 8 meters, and then the current water level is about 12.5 meters below the surface. We don't know how deep the well is because, unfortunately, it does serve a bit today as sort of a place where rubbish will naturally accumulate since it's just a great big pit in the ground. So we got a layer of plastic bags, which means we can't really get into the well itself to measure its depth, which is a shame. But with 12.5 meters from the surface to the water level, if you look at the construction of the well itself, it's made from a combination of ashlar masonry, cut back um, bedrock, so that's a cliff that you find underneath the layers of sand and soil, and fired red bricks. And it's a really impressive piece of architecture. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Perhaps I could just go straight on to talk about how water was lifted from the well. So if you're looking from the top of the well, then on the east and the west side, you've got these transverse arches, and if you're looking at these arches, and you can see wheel marks, and that's a telltale sign of how the water was actually lifted out. In Egypt, from as far as I'm aware, from the first century BC onwards, um, this this type of lifting device called a sakia start being used. And basically, a sakia consists of two gear drives that are set into each other at right angles, and then the horizontal gear drive is pulled by an ox or by a cow or donkey, some piece of burden, and then that will move the vertical gear drive, which is actually sitting inside the well. And attached to the vertical gear drive, we have what's called a pot garland. And a pot garland is it's a very long rope where you tie either buckets or pots onto, and that they will, as the gears move, the pot garland will dip into water inside the well and then pull the water out of the well. And then as the pots they go over the top of the wheel, they will be emptied out into a channel. And then from there on, water will be distributed throughout the monastery.
What kind of pots were used? Are these clay pots we're talking about, or?
We're talking about clay pots. They are quite distinctive. They're called commonly. They're known as sakia pots or kadu pots, and you can tell what they've been used for because of their shape. So um, they can't stand on their own. Basically, they got a little bit of a rim at the top, and they got a knob at the bottom where you can tie a rope around, so that you can tie a rope around the bottom, you can tie a rope around the top, and that's what they've been used for. And we find them on site. We find them broken. We find them scattered. We don't have any other remains of the sakia besides from the wear marks on the well itself, the construction technique of the well, which shows us how water was lifted, and then of course these pots. Um, and they vary considerably in size. So I think the smallest would have been about 4.5, containing about 4.5 liters. But at other sites, they've been found to a size that could contain up to 15 liters or more.
So you need animals to do this. Then it's not there's not a regular source of water that can just be lifted out without some kind of this mechanical aid. It's I guess the otherwise you'd have to go a couple of kilometers to the Nile to get a sort of running source of water.
That would be the alternative. I'm sure there would also been wells in the Nile Valley itself in settlements, but this is the only source of water in the White Monastery. And for the listeners who do not know about Egypt, then I think it's perhaps important to just mention that it does not rain at all. The annual rainfall is something along the lines of 30 millimeters, and the evaporation rate is many times that. So the rain fall is insignificant when it comes to everything from agriculture to drinking water. It would not be a reliable source of water, so it has to come from the ground.
And you mentioned another well, um, a well in the church. Do you want to talk about that now, or
Yes, I
this
can
is
do that.
rather a perplexing idea that is this something that existed as part of the church infrastructure or something that was dug later? Why would it be in a church?
That's a very good question. We don't know the date of the well inside the church. It's not really been possible to examine it in detail. In its current shape, is covered by a very big metal lid, can't really see it. There's a little hatch on top, so you can just about peek inside. And what we have been able to see is that it's a round well, and there are also remains of a transverse arches, which means that as a gear drive would have been used to lift water from this well as well. Other than that, we don't really know that much about it. What perhaps is very interesting is that since it's a round well, it could have been constructed using a well sinking technique, where rather than digging a great big hole, scaffolding everything off, and then building a well up from there, what you do is you build just one part of the well at a time, and then you actually sort of dig underneath that part. So you sink the well down and you build on top until you reach the water level. Um, that means you can basically build a well inside a standing structure such as a church. That would have been possible. Whether it happened that way or whether it was constructed at the same time as the mosque, church, I cannot tell. Um, what is interesting is that it looks like the area immediately south of the church would have been supplied through pipes leading from the church well. Um, and the date of those pipes is approximately 9th, 10th century that we're looking at, perhaps a little bit earlier than that. So it is possible that we're looking at a separate or even later system, but to be honest, I'm very uncertain about the date, a date of the well, as I said, simply because it's not been possible to study it.
Okay, that's fine. Well, let's talk about the system that it depends on the larger well. So it sounds like quite a, as you said, a monumental structure. Is that producing quite a lot of water? And then how is it carried to different areas of the site?
So it's quite speculative how much water could actually be pulled from the well for several reasons. One thing, as I said, is that we don't know how deep it is, and the other one is also that the speed by which the well was replenished. We do not know for sure how quickly the water carrying layers in the ground would actually have refilled the well. I estimated that about 60 cubic meters could have been taken from the well um, per day without exhausting it as a resource. And that would have been more than enough to feed all the different needs of the monastery. So everything from cooking, drinking to industrial processes. But what we see is when we're looking at the system that would have carried water throughout the site is that it consists of five different components. So we've got the pipes themselves that would have led water to where it needed to be. Then we got what's called distribution boxes or inspection boxes, and I'll get back to explaining what they are in a moment. We've got the sedimentation tanks, which basically just for keeping water for sediments, so that all the impurities in the water will fall to the bottom. And we've got clean water, which of course is preferable for both drinking, cooking, and also for various industrial processes. We've got tanks and cisterns that are used for storing water. And then we got also various installations for drainage. The system itself is gravity fed, which means that the well, the head of the wells, is at the highest point of the monastery. And then basically the pipes just facilitates water running downhill. It's not a very steep gradient, which means that water would probably be running quite slowly. There are various ways in which one can increase the water flow. Perhaps we can talk about that later. But it looks as if what happened was that water was just led to the different places where it would need to be. So there would have been some quite central organization in terms of pulling the water out of the well itself, and then it would be led through these different conduits, these pipelines, to where it needed to be. We got these distribution boxes, and distribution boxes is basically, if you imagine sort of a little tank that has one inlet and then several outlets. I find these quite interesting because you can use them just to check if the water is actually flowing. You can also use it as an access point to the pipelines in case you need to clean the pipelines. You can also control whether water should go in one direction or go in all directions at the same time by just blocking off different pipelines. That's not very sophisticated. You could probably just have used some rolled up cloth just to block it with. And and if you're blocking, for example, one exit point, then automatically you would get more water coming through the other pipelines. Um, Inspection boxes are quite similar to these distribution boxes. We find them just outside where water would enter a building. And basically, it's just a little box with the lid on. You can take the lid off, look inside. You can see there's an inlet and there's an outlet. So you can see the water is coming in through the inspection box and coming and then flowing out of the box and into a building. Again, access point to make sure that water is actually flowing, and also an access point in case that you need to clean the pipes.
That's interesting. So this all speaks to what you said near the beginning, where you're talking about this being a clearly planned site with the bread ovens and everything quite well regulated. What you were saying about the gradient and starting with the well, which obviously has to be dug down, but is at the situated at the highest point of the site. This is not just someone coming along and digging somewhere more or less at random to find water. It's somebody has planned this site and has decided where these pipes are going to go, I guess. And also, there's what you're saying about the inspection boxes as well. That you're devising a functional system that can be maintained over the long term. You're not just doing a sort of ad hoc. Oh, I better fix this problem that's arisen. Is that a correct interpretation of what you're saying?
It's interesting the combination of those two because there's no doubt that in its initial layout, we're looking at a very carefully planned system, and we're also looking at a massive financial investment of funding as well as building materials and labor in actually setting up the system. We're looking at a system that is set up by people who really do know what they're doing. This is not just a group of monks who decide to dig a hole to make a well. And this is people who are used to working with water infrastructure who actually laid out the system. But then what we do see as the system is being used over time is quite an interesting approach to fixing things. Because one of the problems, of course, with pipelines is that you do need to maintain them. You need to make sure that well, you don't want to leak, but that's actually the least of your problems. The main problem is a build-up of mineral incrustations and also of sediments. So looking at some of the pipes that are immediately to the east of the well, what we do see is that they just blocked up over time to the point where you just had 1 or 2 centimeters right at the top, which renders them largely unusable. And then rather than trying to replace a pipe, what happened was that someone just laid out a pipe right next to it to replace it, and then did that again and again. So we got this area with about 4 or 5 parallel pipelines, and I can't really explain that in any other way in that someone has tried to fix a problem of pipelines becoming unusable just because of build-up inside.
Do we have any other comparative material to help us interpret this? What do other pipeline systems at other sites look like?
Largely the same if they're not maintained. What you want in a pipeline is a fast flowing, a fast flow, because if your water's moving quite quickly, then it will remove the sediments. So once in a while, you want to really build up pressure and you want to flush out the system. I guess there are other ways that you can clean up your pipelines, but it's very, very difficult and requires having really good access to the pipes. So water is really by far the best way. If we're looking elsewhere at site, it looks like we might actually see um, a system, a later system, or a later addition to the system that was constructed in order to deal with exactly this problem, because we have sluice gates, not large sluice gates as you will see in a river, but tiny little sluice gates as you will see in a pipe. And what you do is you block it off. You block off the pipe, let the water build up, and then you lift the sluice, and then water flushes through, and that's a really good way to clean up your pipe.
Ah,
But we do not see that in the area right next to the well.
we do see that way, but right by the well.
We do not see it right by the well. We only see that in other, perhaps later parts of the water supply system in the area to the south of the church.
Ah, so they've seen there's a problem, and then in later installations they decide to introduce a technique to fix it.
That is my interpretation of what's happening.
Yeah. Just for clarification, how large are these pipes? How big they're quite small.
They vary in size, but in general, the pipes they consist of their ceramic. They consist of the same type of element. So each element of the pipe would be the pipeline would be about 60 centimeter long and about 17, 18 centimeters wide. They're round. And then they're slightly conical in shape so that one end of one pipe would fit into another pipe, and then you secure where the two pipes meet with mortar.
Right. So we're not talking about the famously poisonous lead Roman piping that poisoned inhabitants of Roman cities.
No, we don't. I mean, it is basically a Roman style water supply system that we're looking at, or even Hellenistic style water supply system, but one that has been then elaborated upon in the Roman period. But the use of pipes is very much dependent on the geography. In the Eastern Mediterranean, you see ceramic pipes. In the Western Mediterranean, you see lead pipes.
Yeah.
In the northern part of the Roman Empire, you see wooden pipes.
Yeah.
So it has to do with the material at hand.
Yeah. So silt build-up, we've mentioned. Are there any other maintenance issues that we see in the archaeological record? Any other challenges that the operators of this system faced?
I think that the main challenge really has to do with the building up of sediments inside the pipes. Other challenges, of course, has to do with transporting water to where it's needed. I mentioned before that we got this probably central system that's organizing the lifting of the water out of the well. But then there needs to be some quite careful management of making sure that the water gets to the part of the site where it needs to go. We find cisterns at various sizes. They're not particularly big, but we do find cisterns in various parts of the monastery. So it looks like the water would be transported to where it was needed, and then it would be extracted from the cistern. So, for example, the kitchen has its own system. There's another system where we have evidence of pottery production. There's another system in a third area of the monastery, and so on. And this probably tells us that the water was lifted from the well not continuously but periodically, and then it was a matter of the people who were working in different parts of the monastery, for example, in the kitchen, to just make sure that they had enough water, and make sure that their little local system was filled up so that they would not at any point run out of water.
That makes sense as well in terms of the deployment of the resources of the monastery. If you have you don't necessarily have your water wheel donkey or your water wheel oxen there constantly. You might need them to do other tasks around the monastery, I guess. And then when people's cisterns run out, then you get your donkey on the job and fill up until all the cisterns are filled.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of describing it.
So we've talked about supplying water both for drinking, but you also mentioned industry. So what kind of industries are we talking about? What kind of production went on?
The one type of production, or two types of production, the most easily recognizable, have to do with the dyeing of clothes or fabric, and also with pottery production. Both of those types of production require water. We have remains of pottery production, pottery kiln in an area north of the main well, and we have an area of a series of small tanks set in continuation of each other, which is currently interpreted as being related to dyeing, clothes dyeing in the excavated area just to the south of the church. Then we also do have various other areas where we can see that there are lots of pipes and tanks and so on. Um, but we can't, based on the current archaeological remains, really what has been excavated so far, we can't really say what they were actually used for. But it is usually a strong indication of some sort of industrial process happening if you find a lot of pipes and tanks and systems. Um, so pottery, for example, as I said, it was located just to the north of the area of the main well. You need water in the preparation of the clay, for example. There are also various other stages that would require water. And then, of course, you need to mix the dyes with water when you are dyeing fabric. Um, we do also have several other types of production going on, but they have to do with food production primarily. They would not necessarily have required water. We have things going on such as milling of flour, and as I mentioned earlier, we have production of oil and so on. And neither of these processes would have required water. But we do, of course, have a very large kitchen area, and that would have been a major consumer of water.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about usage of water. What about the wastewater? Presumably, uh, we have toilets. We have also runoff from perhaps these industrial activities. How was the wastewater managed?
But considering how much we know about the distribution of water and the lifting of water outside of the well, we actually know very, very little about wastewater. We do have this structure that by past archaeologists were interpreted. Um, we have a structure that was interpreted as being a toilet block in past archaeological studies, but when I was working on the site as a part of the Yale Monastic Archaeological Project, we revisited this particular feature, and it's very clear there's not a toilet block. So we don't actually know where the toilets were. We don't know where the latrines were. This is it's much more likely to be air shafts or even windows sitting right next to an industrial area. We only got three, maybe four examples of elements of drainage, and they all soakaways. And soakaway in this case, it's basically at the White Monastery. It means that we've got a pot that's set either upside down or with its bottom knocked out, and the water was let into this pot, and then it was just slowly drained into the ground. And we find these soakaways immediately outside of buildings. So, for example, the area that's been interpreted as a dye shop. We've got the end wall of the building, we've got a series of tanks inside the building, and a pipeline leading from the last tank out through the wall of the building into the soakaway, and then it would be draining into the ground. This is quite interesting because it tells us that very little water has actually been used there. You can't let out masses of water into the ground through a soakaway like this, because it would undermine the foundation of the building, and eventually the last thing you want to have in the foundation is water, because that means that the sediments will shift and your building will collapse eventually. There must have been some level of drainage there on a much larger scale, considering how much water was pulled out of the water, out of the well. Sorry, there must have been some level of drainage that we just have not been able to identify in the archaeology yet. If you compare with cities, for example, then you would have central sewers that would be leading the water out of the cities. We also have collection of water, I guess, for being used to water agricultural areas, for examples. But we simply do not have any evidence of that at the White Monastery. So that's the element that we're missing when we're looking at the water supply system. Otherwise, we do have every single element from the point of lifting the water out of the well to the point of storing it where it was used. But when it comes to drainage, then we are a bit in the dark.
And is that a function of the nature of the archaeology that it's difficult to find this, or is this something specific to this site, or are waste water features just generally difficult to find? Or and can you tell? Is it easier to tell between the pipes you're talking about? is it easy to tell the difference between something that's bringing water and taking it away? Is that a clearly visible feature?
So let me start by answering the question about the pipes. Not necessarily. In theory, you can use feeder pipes as drainage pipes. So the pipes that are feeding water to one part of the monastery, they could also have been used. The same type of pipe could have been used for taking water away. So what I'm really looking at when I'm determining whether a pipe is a feeder pipe or a drainage pipe has to do with location. So if you can see that it's leading to a system, for example, or leading to a production area, then it's probably a feeder pipe. I think it has more to do with where excavations have taken place at the White Monastery. So to give you a little bit of the background to the Yale monastic archaeological project that I was part of, rather than doing a lot of excavations ourselves, we were basically revisiting excavations that were carried out by the then Supreme Council of Antiquities, who opened up very large excavations areas, 5 very large excavation areas, and all quite centrally located in the monastery. And we were recording what had been excavated there, trying to get to grips with the architectural stratigraphy, and in some cases having very small excavations, keyhole excavations of just a couple of square meters in order to get to grips with what was actually going on. So that means we don't really have any of the edges of the monastery that's been excavated, and that would perhaps be where we would expect to find main drainage channels. So it's probably a combination of the two, not necessarily being able to recognize when a pipe is used for one or the other, and the other point being the areas in which excavations have been taking place.
That makes sense. So how can we sort of assess the relevance of the site of the White Monastery for thinking about water management systems in the pre-modern North Africa and the Middle East more broadly? Is it a unique site? Is it largely representative of what we think would be happening in other sites in the area?
I would say that the White Monastery is really interesting for several reasons. It is largely representative of sites with similar organization. If you're looking at smaller sites, if you're looking at different monastic sites, or small villages, for example, they would have a very different type of water management and organization. What is really representative about the White Monastery is that we got all these different elements of the supply system. Maybe they can just try to say that again. Just think about how I can say that in a way that makes more sense. I'm glad you can edit this out. um, if we're looking at cities, for example, if we're looking at most settlements, we would usually just have a few of the elements represented in water supply systems. So what's really interesting about the White Monastery is that we actually got all the stages, and that is really unique. But the different elements in themselves are very common. So we find wells with Sakia gear drives all over Egypt. Pipelines are common throughout the Roman world, throughout the Hellenistic world, and also into the Islamic world. Distribution boxes and inspection boxes and so on, systems are also very common elements. So it's really a matter of having the whole system together. And then, of course, what we need to keep in mind is that if you imagine that when you're planning a water supply system, you basically got a list of elements that you can choose from, and then you adjust, you make a system from all the different elements available to you to fit your specific site. So you think carefully about what are your needs at this particular site, what are you going to use water for. It's a bit like when you're planning your electrical system in a modern house. Yes, you can make some modifications later on, or your piping system and so on in a modern house, but you need to think very carefully about how you're going to use the different spaces. Um, so it is both unique and representative at the same time, if that makes sense.
And I guess you already alluded to some of this, what might be specificities of the site. This thing about the shallow gradient and the fact that the pipes are silting up because you don't have that flow. And another site, I guess you have perhaps less silty water, or just the flow is greater, and so you don't have that sort of distinctive build up.
It varies from site to site. It's a very, very common problem with pipes throughout any site really. That pipes will silt up if you don't maintain them properly. They will silt up. That's not unique to the White Monastery. That is commonly found throughout anywhere that pipes are used.
Right, great. Um, and in terms of the sort of long history of the usage of the site, well, or other sites just in general that you've looked at, do we see a change in technique or in technology or in management from the Roman period into the Islamic period, or is it more a question of continuity, or are there some ruptures that we see?
We are largely looking at continuity. This is a system that works really well as long as it's maintained, then it works really well. Um, Again, it's a type of system that's adjusted from site to site, but the basic elements they remain the same. And the secure gear drive, for example, is used today.
Right.
Perhaps less so today because we have mechanical pumps, but it's commonly used until at least into the 19th, early 20th century in various parts of Egypt and Sudan, and probably also other parts of North Africa. Um, so I would say that we are looking at a system of long-term continuity.
Right. That makes sense. Though I know that you've written about the decline in multi-seater toilets, but multi-seater public toilets. That's one thing at least that changes with the Islamic era.
That's true. That's true. I wouldn't call it decline. Let's just call it a transformation in perceptions of privacy and um, and bodily behavior in public.
Yes. Yeah. Makes sense. My co-producer of this podcast, Jauke Heringa, was doing some reading about the White Monastery, and he mentioned that several sites in Egypt have been having problems because of the rising in water table due to the Aswan High Dam. Is that a problem that we see in the White Monastery?
That's a really interesting point. So the Aswan Dam is causing massive problems for lots of other sites, especially those that are located in the Nile Valley or in cities like Cairo, for example. All Cairo was flooded until a very elaborate drainage system was put in. It's not a problem in the White Monastery because it's located at a plateau just above the agricultural green Nile Valley. So it's raised about 6 meters above the archaeological remains are raised about 6 meters above the floor of the Nile Valley, and that is enough to ensure that the archaeological remains are actually not affected by the raising groundwater. But it's actually an interesting point, and one thing that might be worth including in the podcast, if it can be fitted in, is that, of course, before the construction of the Aswan Dam, then the Nile there would be the annual inundation of the Nile, at which point the Nile Valley would have been largely flooded. Um, this would have happened through what's known as basin irrigation, where you trap the water in very large basins, and we think perhaps about sort of, bathtub basins. That's not what we're looking at in the Nile Valley. We're looking at basins that are 100 of square kilometers. So the White Monastery, for example, was located just at the edge of one massive basin that would have trapped water for about 4 months of the year before then a dike was broken and the water was led into another basin. That means that the White Monastery for 4 months of the year would have been sitting at the edge of a very big lake. It also meant that the water inside the wells would have risen with the inundation of the Nile and then also fallen um, as the water would have gone down.
Well, I think that we've got through lots of really interesting stuff. Is there anything else you'd like to mention at this point? Other sites that you've been working on, or other things that you missed saying while we were talking?
I think in terms of the White Monastery, we covered most of the basic points. I do work on other sites as well. I work in Jerash in northern Jordan. And of course, there we're looking at a completely different water supply system because it's a city. And what is perhaps unique about the White Monastery is that because it is, in monastic terms, it's a very large site. In terms of settlements, it's a small site. So that's why you can actually just have one or two systems that can be centrally managed. If you're looking at a city the size of Jerash, for example, we're looking at something like 800,000 square meters. It it has a completely different level of water supply systems. Here we're looking at aqueducts combined with natural springs. We're looking at massive pipelines, and we're looking at underground systems that would have been storing water. But interestingly, we got very few pipes, for example. We do not know very much about how water was distributed throughout the site itself. We do, of course, have a very elaborate central sewage system, so we can see how water was led out of specific buildings, for example, bathhouses, how it was led out into the main sewers, and how the sewers then would have drained into the river or out of the city. We've got two different sewage systems, so that's just a whole different scale. It's a whole different scale. But if you're breaking it down into sort of the individual elements of having a source of water, having distribution, having storage, and so on, then it is the same idea, but on a very different scale.
Thank you. Well, just to finish up, I'd like to sort of reflect on, well, I guess the uses of history and what we can gain from thinking about water management in the past. We live in a time of water crisis, at least in many places in the world. So what kind of insights do you think we can gain from this kind of study?
I think the main point we can take away when we're looking at the water supply system of past settlements is that water is treated as a very precious resource. And one thing we probably tend to do today, at least in certain parts of the world, is treating water as if it's an inexhaustible resource, and certainly it's not. And we can see, looking at the White Monastery, but also looking at other sites such as Jerash, is that water is very, very carefully managed and it's very carefully used. And I think that's probably the main thing that we can learn from the past.
Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and good luck with your ongoing excavations.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's all from us today. Thank you for listening.